Wait, what happens when the most feared man in Genoa City stops looking like the puppet master and starts looking like the one person everybody might finally be able to pin this mess on? Because that is the feeling hanging over the young and the restless right now. Not just scandal, not just betrayal, not just another Newman family power play, but something stranger and far more dangerous. The possibility that Victor Newman, the man who usually controls the board, could suddenly become the target of the very chaos he thought he was directing from the shadows. And if that sounds shocking, it gets even more unsettling when you realize the people who could expose him are not random enemies. They are the unstable ally, the desperate doctor, the wounded ex, the suspicious son, the conflicted wife, and the man who swore he was done with revenge until the latest attack pushed him right back to the edge. I'm Anderson, and this is Soap Pulse, Soapistry Buzz if you know us from there, and if you love smart soap breakdowns like this, hit like, subscribe, and share. Before we dive in, because this week's Y and R predictions are not just juicy, they raise a bigger question fans cannot stop asking. What is Victor really willing to destroy to keep control, and what happens when the people around him finally decide they have had enough? According to official spoilers and the chain of events already playing out, this week is shaping up to be less about one isolated attack and more about a pattern. A pattern that, if the characters inside this story start connecting the same dots fans have been staring at, could place Victor right in the center of a deeply ugly fallout. And to understand why audiences should care, you have to start with the simple truth that Victor Newman is not just another character on this canvas. He is the force field around it. For decades, Victor has operated like a kingmaker, a punisher, a patriarch, and, depending on who you ask, either the last great protector of his family or the one person who keeps creating the emergencies he later pretends to solve. That contradiction is exactly why this week feels so combustible. Because when Victor acts, people around him always pay the price. The question now is whether the price has gotten so high and the collateral damage so obvious that even his closest circle can no longer rationalize it away. That is where the story turns from scandal into something closer to an investigation, because the alleged pieces of this plot are not floating separately anymore. They are starting to touch Patty, Dr. Markham, Jack, Diane, Nikki, Sally, Adam, Chelsea, Kyle, Billy. Every one of those names now connects back in some way to Victor's decisions, Victor's grudges, Victor's money, or Victor's need to control the outcome before anyone else even understands the game. And if you have watched this show long enough, you know that once Victor sees someone as a threat, he does not merely oppose them, he pressures them, he isolates them, he pushes until the other person breaks, and then somehow still presents himself as the victim of their response. That is why the first major prediction this week is so explosive. Patty, one of the most volatile figures anywhere near this story, may finally agree to rat out Victor. But this is Patty we are talking about, which means if she flips, it is not going to happen cleanly, calmly, or for purely moral reasons. It is going to come with a price, and that price could say as much about the sickness of this entire situation as any confession ever could. The setup here is already fascinating. Wednesday's spoilers have Kyle bargaining with Patty, and when Kyle goes to see her in jail, Patty reportedly makes it clear that he is not the Abbott she was hoping to see. That one little detail matters more than it may seem, because it tells you Patty is not focused on justice. She is focused on obsession, on fantasy, on unresolved fixation. She is still Patty, still locked into that warped emotional orbit where Jack occupies a place no logic can touch. So now imagine Kyle walking into that cell not just as a grandson trying to defend his family, but as a man trying to crack open the truth behind what happened to Diane and Jack. Kyle and Billy are already operating from the belief that Victor was bankrolling Patty, and viewers know enough to understand why that suspicion has weight. At a minimum, Victor brought Patty to town. That part is already out there in the story. Beyond that, there is every suggestion that money changed hands. If Patty acted and Victor funded her, then the moral distance between mastermind and attacker starts getting very small, very fast. But here is where it gets deliciously uncomfortable. Patty has no real reason to stay loyal to Victor. None. He is not her family. He is not her savior. He is not some sacred cause. He is a transactional partner in a dirty scheme, and dirty schemes have a way of collapsing the minute one participant realizes the other cannot protect them anymore. So yes, Patty may flip, but if she does, what will she want from Jack? That is the sinister little twist hanging over this prediction, because Patty does not think like a rational cooperator in a courtroom drama. She thinks like a woman whose desires, resentments, and delusions all bleed together. Maybe she wants attention. Maybe she wants sympathy. Maybe she wants one final fantasy fulfilled before the walls close in. Something twisted, something intimate, something only Jack could give or refuse to give. And that possibility creates a moral trap for Kyle too. How far do you go to expose Victor if the only witness you have is Patty, and Patty wants something disturbing in return? Suddenly, this is not just a revenge story. It is a story about whether justice itself has become contaminated by the people required to deliver it. That is exactly the kind of complication that keeps fans glued to these plots, because nothing comes easy and every answer opens a new ethical mess. And underneath all of it sits the larger issue. If Patty talks, does Victor finally face consequences, or does the show once again let him slip through because Victor Newman somehow always finds a way to turn accountability into just another temporary inconvenience? That fan frustration is real. Viewers have watched Victor do awful things for years and still remain the man everyone eventually circles back to, excuses, protects, and even romanticizes. And nowhere is that tension more obvious than in the dynamic unfolding between Nikki and Victor. Because one of the most psychologically revealing predictions this week is not about evidence or money or police action. It is about denial. It is about what happens when the woman closest to Victor may once again choose emotional survival over hard truth. According to spoilers, Nikki is struggling with her condition, and she and Victoria go to see Jack in the hospital. That alone is loaded, because Jack is not some distant acquaintance in this story. He is the wounded man at the center of a spiraling disaster Victor seems desperate to blame on everyone except himself. Then comes Wednesday, when Victor accuses Nikki of betrayal, and by Friday, incredibly, the two of them are said to agree to a fresh start. That progression is so classic Newman marriage politics, it almost hurts. Injury, suspicion, manipulation, emotional pressure, and then reconciliation before the underlying rot is ever really addressed. And the timing matters. Nikki is vulnerable right now. Physically vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable, likely disoriented, and still in a state where she may not even have the clarity to confront what is right in front of her. If she visits Jack, Victor frames it as betrayal. If she shows compassion, Victor turns it into disloyalty. If she seeks the truth, Victor recasts himself as the wronged husband. That is not just conflict, that is control through guilt. And what makes it even harder to watch is that Nikki may partly know better and still choose the easier emotional route, because the alternative would mean admitting that the man she keeps returning to may have helped unleash the very violence now tearing through people she cares about. That is a brutal admission for any character to make, especially a character who has spent years trapped in the cycle of defending, leaving, forgiving, and rejoining Victor. So yes, a fresh start may sound hopeful on paper, but in the context of everything else happening, it may actually be the darkest sign of all. Because if Nikki chooses reconciliation while refusing to confront Victor's possible role in what happened to Jack, then she becomes part of the shield around him again. Not maliciously, maybe not even consciously, but effectively. And fans are tired of that shield, tired of watching Victor act, Nikki absorb, and the family reset without meaningful reckoning. This is why the next layer of the story matters so much, because the pressure on Victor is not only coming from older enemies or long-time family wounds, it is also now colliding with a newer, more emotionally intimate problem: Sally. Specifically, what happens when Victor's corporate aggression starts threatening a pregnant woman already carrying unimaginable grief, and his own son looks at him and realizes there may be no humane limit to what Victor is willing to do. According to spoilers, Adam tries to reason with Victor while Chelsea is there, asking for 6 months to pursue a different plan with Chelsea and essentially telling his father to back off. On top of that, Sally accuses Adam and Chelsea of sabotage, while Victor reportedly plays hardball with Spectra Charles. And that is where this storyline stops being just another business war and starts feeling personal in a way that could split the family from the inside. Adam already knows Victor gave Arabesque to Phyllis because he wanted to use it as media. He also knows Victor has his eye on taking over Sally's company, and what should hit viewers right in the chest is Adam's reported plea that Sally is pregnant, that stress matters, that this is not just business strategy but a real human situation, especially after the previous loss Adam and Sally endured. If Victor hears all that and still pushes forward, then what exactly is left of the myth that everything he does is for family? Family becomes the excuse, not the motive. Control becomes the motive. Domination becomes the motive. Winning becomes the motive. That is why this prediction that Adam and Chelsea may actually undermine Victor is so compelling, because it suggests a line may finally have been crossed for people who usually live close enough to Victor to understand exactly how dangerous it is to oppose him. Chelsea was never fully comfortable with Victor's earlier campaigns, especially when his obsession with destroying Billy was on the table. And if Sally believes Adam and Chelsea are the ones sabotaging Spectra Charles, there is a good chance they may come clean and tell her the truth. It is Victor, not us, and we do not support this. Think about the significance of that. Not just Adam quietly disagreeing, not just Chelsea privately disapproving, but the possibility of them actively undermining Victor's plan to protect Sally. That would be more than resistance. That would be betrayal, at least in Victor's eyes. And Victor does not forgive betrayal. He catalogs it, he punishes it, he waits for leverage. So if Adam and Chelsea go down that road, they are not merely stepping into a business dispute. They are stepping into war with the man who taught them how ruthless these wars can become. And yet, from a storytelling standpoint, that may be precisely why this plot works. Because it forces the audience to ask a brutal question: who is Victor actually protecting anymore if the people opposing him are doing so in the name of protecting the vulnerable people he claims to care about? That is the contradiction that makes this week so rich. Victor's defenders may still call him strategic, his critics will call him monstrous, but the more he presses forward against Sally, the harder it becomes for anyone to pretend those are just two equal interpretations of the same conduct. Then, just when you think the story is already full enough, the Billy Abbott factor surges back into focus, and that may be the most combustible element of all. Because Billy, more than almost anyone, understands the cost of making your life about Victor Newman. He knows what obsession does. He knows how revenge disguises itself as righteousness. He knows the emotional bill always arrives later. That is why his initial instinct to talk Kyle out of going after Victor makes so much sense. Billy has lived that movie before. He knows how it ends, or at least he thinks he does, but what happens when the very thing Billy warns Kyle against becomes impossible to ignore because Victor does not stop at Jack or Diane or old grudges? What happens when Billy realizes Victor is now coming for Sally too? According to spoilers, Billy commiserates with Kyle and points out that Victor is a big target everybody somehow misses. Kyle says nothing, which is often more dangerous than a speech, because silence can mean planning. Then Victor gives Kyle a warning shot. Then Kyle bargains with Patty. Then Victor plays hardball with Sally's company. You can almost feel Billy's resistance eroding in slow motion. At first, he tells Kyle not to get sucked into revenge because nobody wins against Victor that way. He ties it back to his own losses, to Victoria, to the long, ugly reach Victor has had over his life. He tells Kyle his priorities should be Sally and their baby, not another blood feud. That is Billy trying to save someone else from becoming the version of himself he most regrets. But if Billy sees Victor targeting Sally anyway, that entire moral stance may collapse, because now the threat is no longer abstract. Now it is immediate. It is intimate. It is aimed at a woman Billy cares about and at a future family he wants to protect. And once Billy starts viewing Victor's latest move not as another endless Newman-Abbott vendetta, but as a direct threat to Sally and the child, the old rules may no longer apply. Suddenly, joining Kyle does not feel like backsliding. It feels, in Billy's mind, like defense. Necessary defense. Defensive revenge is still revenge, of course, but that is how these spirals always begin. A person tells himself, this time is different. This time it is justified. This time I am not acting out of ego. I am acting out of love, outrage, protection. And that psychological shift is exactly what makes Billy so dangerous when pushed. Because the moment he stops believing he is re-entering the revenge game and starts believing he is morally obligated to finish it, Victor has a much bigger problem than one angry Abbott grandson. He has two. Kyle brings youthful intensity, a sharper focus on the immediate evidence, and a personal investment in saving his family. Billy brings history, pain, pattern recognition, and a deep emotional need to prove Victor cannot keep doing this forever. Put them together, and the anti-Victor campaign becomes much more organized, much more emotionally charged, and much harder for Victor to laugh off as the whining of damaged enemies. But even that may not be the biggest threat, because the most dangerous people in a cover-up are often not the obvious enemies outside the circle. They are the weak links inside it. And that brings us to Dr. Markham, who may be the single most likely person to crack under pressure if authorities, or even just the story's key players, start pulling on the right thread. This prediction is one of the most fascinating because it has the cold logic of self-preservation all over it. Patty may be unstable, Victor may be arrogant, but Dr. Markham? Dr. Markham looks like a man who would save himself first and explain himself later, and if he gets arrested, as many viewers believe he should, the odds of him suddenly finding a conscience may be low, but the odds of him finding a survival instinct may be sky high. The facts inside the storyline are already ugly enough. Diane was allegedly being held against her will. Kyle reportedly rescued her. There were bars on the windows. There were threatening conditions around the property. The doctor lied to police about Patty and Diane. Diane is a living witness. Kyle is a witness. Detective Burrow is already part of this arc. Once law enforcement pressure becomes real, Markham has choices to make and none of them are good. Stay loyal and risk going down hard or start naming names. If Patty flips, he can flip. If he flips first, he gains leverage. If there is any money trail at all, any indication that Victor's cash flowed through this operation, then Markham's testimony could become the thing Victor cannot dismiss as family bitterness or romantic delusion. Because Patty can be painted as unstable, Billy can be painted as obsessed, Kyle can be painted as emotional, but a doctor with direct operational knowledge, a doctor facing charges and talking immunity, that is different. That is dangerous. And yes, Markham is hardly a noble source. In fact, the less noble he is, the more believable his turn might be. People like that do not confess because they suddenly discover morality. They confess because the deal in front of them is better than the prison cell behind them. That is why the possibility of Markham testifying against Victor for immunity feels so potent. It would not cleanse anyone. It would not magically make Patty truthful or Markham honorable. But it could, finally, give the accusations against Victor a shape that looks less like suspicion and more like structure. And once structure appears, the whole story changes. Because then we are no longer talking about whether Victor was vaguely involved in the atmosphere surrounding these attacks. We are talking about whether multiple compromised people can connect him to a specific operation with motive, financing, and intended outcomes. That is when even Victor's greatest skill, controlling the narrative, starts to fail. And here is the really haunting part. The biggest revelation this week may not be whether Victor gets arrested, exposed, forgiven, or protected. It may be something much more psychologically devastating, that nearly every person around him has reached some version of a breaking point. Patty may break because she wants something only Jack can give. Markham may break because he wants immunity. Adam may break because he cannot stomach what Victor is doing to Sally. Chelsea may break because she sees the damage before it becomes irreversible. Billy may break because Victor never stops. Kyle may break because Jack nearly died and Diane was terrorized. Nikki may even break in the opposite direction by choosing denial so completely that it tells us just how impossible life with Victor has become. That is the real pattern here. Victor does not just create enemies, he creates pressure cookers. He pushes everyone to the place where they either become complicit, become casualties, or become whistleblowers. And once enough people are standing in those categories at the same time, the empire starts looking less stable than it has in years. That is why this week's predictions matter beyond any one spoiler. They suggest the show may be building toward a rare kind of reckoning, not necessarily a courtroom victory, not necessarily a clean takedown, but a reckoning in perception. A moment when the people around Victor can no longer pretend his methods are unfortunate but necessary. A moment when the cost becomes impossible to ignore. Jack in a hospital bed, Diane traumatized, Sally endangered by stress and corporate aggression, Adam horrified, Chelsea conflicted, Kyle radicalized. Billy tempted back into war, Nikki emotionally cornered, Patty bargaining from a jail cell, Markham potentially calculating his next lie. If you line up all those pieces, the picture that emerges is not of a strong patriarch managing chaos. It is of a man whose need to dominate may be creating chaos faster than he can contain it. And maybe that is why fans are so fired up right now, not just because they want justice for Jack or Diane, though they do, not just because they want Victor called out, though they absolutely do, but because they are tired of the same old cycle where power excuses cruelty and loyalty becomes a shield against accountability. Viewers want consequences. They want memory in this story. They want the damage to matter. They want the people Victor hurts directly or indirectly to do more than recover and move on. They want someone to finally say enough. And the person most likely to say that in a way that changes the board may not even be the obvious hero. It could be Billy deciding this latest move against Sally is the final insult. It could be Kyle making a cold strategic play with Patty that no one else was willing to make. It could be Adam choosing conscience over legacy. It could be Markham selling out the operation to save his own skin. Or, in the strangest twist of all, it could be Patty, because people like Patty are often dismissed as too erratic to matter until the moment they say the one true thing everyone else was too afraid to say out loud. And if that happens, if Patty and Markham both turn and the story starts tracing the path back to Victor, then what fans have long felt emotionally could begin to look undeniable inside the narrative itself. Not that Victor is powerful, we already know that. Not that Victor is feared, we know that too. But that Victor's greatest vulnerability may be the illusion that fear is the same as loyalty. It is not. Fear buys silence for a while. It buys compliance. It buys hesitation. But under enough pressure, fear curdles into resentment, and resentment starts talking. That is the storm forming around him now. A storm made not of one enemy's revenge, but of many people's accumulated limits. And that is why this week feels different. Because for once, Victor may not be facing a single challenger he can outmaneuver. He may be facing the consequences of having pushed too many people too far at exactly the same time. Whether the show follows through is another question, and longtime viewers are right to be skeptical. This is Victor Newman. The man has escaped disaster so many times that survival almost feels built into his DNA, but that does not lessen the suspense. It heightens it, because the closer the story gets to real exposure, the more viewers lean in waiting to see whether the impossible finally happens, or whether the machine closes ranks one more time. And maybe that is the bigger reason soap fans stay so emotionally invested. Underneath all the glamour, the seduction, the betrayals, and the power plays, stories like this tap into something very recognizable in real life too. The terrifying durability of powerful people who keep getting away with damage because the people around them are invested in the fantasy that they need them. This week, Y&R seems ready to ask whether that fantasy is finally cracking. If Victor can be accused, if Billy has truly had enough, if Adam and Chelsea choose resistance, if Nikki chooses denial, if Patty bargains, and if Markham starts thinking like a survivor instead of a co-conspirator, then the question is no longer whether trouble is coming. The question is, who will break first, who will speak first, and whether the truth, once it starts leaking out, can be contained by a man who has spent his whole life believing he controls every ending. And if he cannot, then the most shocking twist of all may not be that Victor Newman is accused. It may be that for the first time in a very long time, the accusation actually sticks.